What if fundraising's not just about the bottom line? What if it is about who you become and what you believe in the process? And what if the journey is bigger than you and your ministry?
Welcome to Season 4 of It's Not About the Money. Join us as we examine elements of ministry fundraising through the unique lens of personal formation. Let's dive in.
Hello, welcome back to our mini-series on church partnerships. This is Heather, joined again today by Andy and Corey. Welcome, guys. And we are going to be talking about a wide variety of topics related to finding churches, finding advocates when you have to start from scratch, and so on. When it comes to church partnerships and fundraising, the approach we take makes all the difference. Too often, support raising can feel like a transactional process, seeking financial backing to sustain ministry work. But what if we reframed it? What if, instead of looking for churches to fund us, we saw ourselves as casting a vision for churches to join in God's mission? This subtle but powerful shift can transform the way we engage with congregations. So today, we'll explore how to prepare for these connections, guided by both biblical principles and practical strategies. How does a strong theological foundation shape our approach to church partnerships? And what changes when we see fundraising not just as financial support, but as an invitation to something greater? So I want to get us started by looking specifically at what you do to find churches to ask. So in the module, we talk about beginning with your home church. And I guess, Corey, I'd love to just get started with some best practices for approaching a person's own church for partnership, and then what common mistakes we could avoid in that.
Good question. I think the first thing would be to start with asking what is available at the church. Like, is there a missions committee that you should go to? Is there a missions pastor? Some churches have a specific elder that's focused on missions. Or if it's just a small church, maybe just talking to that pastor. But knowing the right person to go to first is where you would start. I think one of the things to avoid is just the timing of that conversation and making sure that the timing is right and not assuming that you can bring up everything as soon as you talk to that person, like catch them in the hallway and just start to tell your whole mission story. You know, I've definitely learned the hard way on that, but just setting up an actual time to meet and then sharing a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's really good counsel, Corey, because I can imagine that, you know, when people are preparing to talk to somebody and they're excited about what they're doing, maybe they see them after church and think, oh, this is an opportunity. And the person that they approach might be genuinely interested to hear more, but it might not be the setting for that.
That's true. Yeah. So if they start to ask a lot of questions, you can just say, hey, I'd love to share more. We can set up a time to meet and I'll tell you more about it.
And I think just having never been on church staff myself, but I think that my impression is that my pastors are always spinning a lot of plates.
Yeah.
They have a lot of people pulling on them and asking them to help, and they like to do that, but don't mistake their need to move on to something else as disinterest. Is that what we're saying too?
Right. Yes. So don't linger too long in a moment that's not set up well for them to really hear and be able to engage. And also don't write it off if they don't have time to linger.
I think in my experience as well, things tend to move a little bit slower in church world than they do in like corporate America, especially, but even in nonprofit world that we live in, that we work in. So just if you have a very narrow window, a very short runway before a decision needs to be made, just know that that is adding additional challenges.
Right.
I was going to say, I think also some churches may want to see that you are serious about what you're doing and what you're saying. And so if the church is not your home church, they may stand back a little bit, watch you do your mission for a while, get your newsletters, read about your work, learn about it, and then come on board later. That's definitely happened for me.
They want to ease into it a little bit.
Right.
Yeah. And since you mentioned churches that are not your own home church, I guess I would like to kind of push into that a little bit. Just ask, beyond your home church, we do encourage people to be aware of the personal connections they have to other churches and to not be shy about leveraging those connections in order to have opportunity to speak to other churches. How would you counsel someone to effectively identify and approach churches they do have indirect ties to?
I would say the first thing is to look where your personal connections are and just look at your friend group, look at the people in your community or people that you've known in the past, like people who are really involved in their churches. Maybe they're in some type of leadership, or there's churches that you may have partnered with in some projects in your community, or you partnered with on a mission trip before. Maybe you have a neighbor who's an elder in their church, or your doctor is on their missions committee at their church. Different things that you may not even have thought about, just people in your daily life who are very involved in their church and have a heart for missions. Those would be great people to help you get your foot in the door.
Mm. Okay, so let's explore something really quickly that we've talked about before. This idea that Steve Shadrach has when you're partnering with churches is to go to the leader and ask that person for support to deepen that relationship. What do we think about that?
So you're saying, like, personally ask that person for their family to be on your support team even before their church gets on board.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a great idea. I can't think of an example where I've done it in the past, because the God Ask book was not out yet when I was fundraising. Honestly, never occurred to me. But now, after reading this quote from Steve, I'm just thinking that would be a great foundation, because then that pastor could really be an advocate and they could say, my family is personally giving to this missionary, and this is why I think we all should too.
I also don't think I experienced that personally, but I do agree with it in theory. I think
Yeah.
it sounds great in theory. I'll also reference something that I learned from one of our other guests on the show, Mary Baloney. I remember very distinctly, this was burned to my memory. She was talking to her co-host, Mike Kim, and they were talking about approaching people in authority or some people with influence or people with a lot of money. And they suggested, instead of asking for money directly from those people, instead ask for advice. They said, if you ask for money, there's a good chance you're going to get advice. But if you ask for advice, somehow my interpretation is that they're more bought in and they're more invested instantly by giving you advice and they want to see you succeed. Mm-hmm. So that would be an interesting thing to try out.
Well, and those people have so much experience of dealing with missionaries and others who are raising support, and they know what's up, so they can help you.
Right. And they know the individuals in their church, especially if you've never been to that church or you have a very loose connection. How do you even know where to start? So that, I think, also just makes logical sense to go to them and say, hey, this is your body. You have shepherded this group. Where would you start if you were me?
Yeah, that's really great. Well, and speaking of advocates, I would also like to push into, why do we think it is important to have an advocate within a church setting? What makes an effective advocate? Because you could find somebody connected to the church, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it will be a helpful advocate. So what are your thoughts on that, guys?
It's got to be someone who is excited about your ministry. First and foremost, yes, they do need to be well connected within their church, but I don't think that's necessarily the primary thing. They're excited about your ministry, then they will go and find the people they need to connect with to tell them about your ministry.
So it doesn't need to be somebody who's been on the mission field before necessarily, right, but just someone who has a heart for the Great Commission and a heart for international or whatever you're doing. It doesn't have to be international. Yeah.
Yeah. So it could be like, I've seen so many different types of advocates in my fundraising journey. Sometimes it's someone who's already on my financial partnership team and they're supporting me, so they want other people to as well. Or sometimes it's someone who doesn't have the financial resources or ability to support me, but they know a lot of people, so they want to tell everybody about it. This happened to me when I started fundraising right out of college, and I had a lot of college friends who were just as poor as me and they couldn't support me, but they came from a lot of churches and they would help me get connected to their pastors and their churches. And that ended up being a huge blessing.
And I think that carries over. It makes sense, right? That carries over that when you are funded and you are on the field to maintain those advocate relationships. Because again, going back to what we said earlier, the people in leadership have a lot of plates spinning. And if you are just a very like secondary, tertiary plate in their orbit, it's very likely that they're not going to think about you very much unless somebody is there saying, hey, what about Corey? We haven't heard from her lately. Let's reach out to her.
Mm.
Yeah, so true. And I think those advocates can, like, especially if the church is not your home church, those advocates can help you plan events and speaking engagements. So they can help talk with the pastor and get you set up to come and share. They can organize a potluck or an ice cream social or something for you, and it's going to go a lot better with them organizing it than with you coming in and introducing yourself as a stranger, and so letting them take the reins on that.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge. Like, people might not even remember who you are, right, and you're coming in saying, hey, let's have a meeting about this. Plus, it takes a lot of weight off of your shoulders. How many churches did you have, Corey? You have
12.
The idea of managing all that clerical, logistical detail and setting all those up in different locations, that makes me not want to do that at all.
No. I mean, I would usually, when I was traveling through to visit, I had like a church tour that I did. And so I would just tell people, hey, this is when I'm going to be in town. You want to set something up? And they would set it up and tell me when to be there. And I would just come prepared to share, but they would have all the details figured out. So
you had
some amazing advocates.
You had roadies.
I did. Yep. It was a 7-state, 12 church tour every time we went.
Wow.
Cool.
That is really cool. So it seems like it would be very important for an advocate to be somebody with some level of maybe proactiveness, very dependable, high communication, good rapport between you, clear communication. It sounds like the nature of this kind of partnership, partnering as an advocate would feel a little bit more formal than just saying, hey, would you be willing it? Or to what extent do you think that would need to be kind of like a core team where people are kind of making a commitment? And to what extent is it just kind of one-off or more casual? What do you guys think?
I think it's important to make the ask to your advocate like you would make an ask for support. And, really make sure that they understand your ministry and that you've done your ministry presentation and shared that with them. First, lay out for them how they can help you specifically. So instead of a normal presentation where you're saying, this is what I need at this much per month, lay it out as this is what I need in terms of communication, in terms of networking, in terms of contacts. And then, let them know what you think the next steps might be. Ask them who they know, and then start to really brainstorm together and ask them, like, give them some time to think about it, but ask them if they would be willing to commit to helping you network within that church.
Mm-hmm.
So you, as the asker, really need to have your ducks in a row. You really need to have thought through all the ramifications of what you're actually asking them to do.
Yes, that's right. You need to think through, like, especially if you're going to be full-time, long-term fundraiser, this means 2-3 years from now, when you come back home on furlough, this person needs to be keeping up with you, reminding the church leaders about you coming, helping to organize something, etc. It doesn't always have to be a big event, but at least they should be in the know and committed to reminding people about you.
You want to avoid a sense of surprises.
Yes.
Down the road. There should be no surprises. But what about the core team thing? Heather, you asked about should they be on the core team? That's an interesting question, because if it was like I've got two churches, that to me says yes. Okay, I can enfold two people that maybe I don't know as well into my core team, and that makes sense to me. But if I had 12 churches like Corey, that makes me want to think of maybe I need a secondary like advocate team or something, where I have my core team, my bullseye team, and then I have this other layer of care that doesn't have to come to all my core team meetings, but is also getting another level of intentionality.
Yeah. And I wonder, I mean, not to make this too like rigid and high structure, but I wonder to what extent you just know that part of your core team is someone who's committed to informing your advocates or kind of keeping your advocates in the loop, you know? I mean, I think that in some ways to steward all of the people and churches that might be joining with you in this task, it can just be really helpful to have identified streams of good communication and clarity.
I really like that, actually, that having an advocate manager, if you get to that point where you need that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about when, okay, so let's say you've had an experience with your home church, you've identified some advocates, you're working with, those people in their churches. What about when you're approaching a church and you don't have any connections? In the module, we talk about how a cold approach is the least effective. If someone feels led to approach a church that they have no ties to, what steps should they take to really set themselves up well for a positive response?
I've never done this, so Corey, I'm curious.
Yeah. So in my experience, small churches are more likely to be good places to start, because especially, I've talked before in some other podcasts about coming from a rural area, and those are small churches. And a lot of those do not have a lot of missionary partners. And a lot of them are just like so interested to hear about anyone who is doing anything outside of their community, because it feels novel for them in a way. And like they want to get on board with supporting something overseas. And so, those are also easier to connect with leadership, because there's usually only one or two people in leadership in terms of the pastoral staff. It's easier to find advocates within those churches. Even if you don't have connections, you can quickly find the people who are excited to get on board. I think that larger churches would be more challenging because they draw more attention from people who make missions funding requests. They're kind of oversaturated. They have a lot of specific parameters already in place and filters to filter financial requests. I wouldn't necessarily rule them out completely, but just go directly to the missions committee or missions pastor. But I think if you're going to start from scratch, the first thing to do would be to show up at some type of event and just make that first impression to introduce yourself, to find the pastor, and then give them your very short elevator pitch and ask for a meeting. I always try to get that meeting and find out who are the people that you need to be meeting with. And then once you get that meeting, then it's a little bit easier to explain more about who you are, what you do. And yeah, that's how I would try to get the foot in the door.
I wonder too, if different denominations have different expectations and different standards.
They do. Yes.
Right. So some denominations, it feels like, and this is the minority, but I have worked with some where they actually expect you to go from church to church to church in the denomination.
Right.
And nobody in those churches, but those groups are used to people coming in and saying, I'm in this church, I'm in the network, and I'm going to tell you about this mission that I'm going on. So that's an important thing just to think through as well on the front end.
I call that deputation. And yeah, I have coached some missionaries who are in a denomination like that, and they do it. They go from church to church, and it works for them because they're within a denomination that supports them. I would not counsel anyone to spend a lot of their time doing this at random churches, make this your main gig,
Right. I wondered, Corey, too, as you were talking, I just kind of thought, what if if you had a long-term perspective, like I'm going to be on the field for like 5 years. You go to these people and say, my first ask is, I would just like to get in front of your congregation and ask for prayer. I'd like to update you. I'd like to keep you in the know and just to partner with you on this level. And then if you like this ministry and you feel like this is like your congregation is fed by this, next year I'll talk to you about financial partnership.
100%.
Nice.
Yep. So I would definitely recommend that for anyone who's thinking long term, especially if you already have your home church and others supporting you, to get the prayer support first and to get that acknowledgement from the congregation that they know who you are. I had this one small church of about 200 people, and they allowed me to come and share and then send my newsletters. And they had a missionary bulletin board, and they posted my newsletters on there. And it was about 1 or 2 years in. I was on the field for 9 years. It took 1 or 2 years, and they said, we have never had a missionary that communicates with us like so often and so well. And we love to have your newsletters, and we want to put them up on our bulletin board. And so we'd like to start supporting you now financially.
That's awesome.
That just having that is super important.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
No, go.
And what I love about that is that it's not just, I don't know, I feel like there's a way we could talk about this where people are understanding like, oh, okay, if I just cultivate this relationship long enough, like it will bear fruit for me. But actually what's happening is that congregation over time is becoming more drawn to what God is doing. And you just happen to be part of that. And because they're more drawn to what God is doing, they're investing more and more of themselves in that. And so again, it's the mutual formation, the mutual provision, community and financial provision for you and provision for them of being given opportunity to see what God is up to in other parts of the world. And so, yeah, I just really love that. I love that unfolding relationship and how it continues because God is doing real things and bringing good,
Yeah, I think that's so true, Heather, because it's just like fundraising from individuals or families. There are people out there who are looking for an opportunity to give their resources and they are really wanting to see what God is doing around the world. And there are churches like that who are wanting to know, what is God doing? Can God bring us someone who will share with us firsthand what they see God doing? And that's a huge way that we can bless those churches too.
Mm-hmm. And I love that the focus is not on who can give me the most money and how can I collect this. It's these churches, your examples, Corey, they aren't mobilized. They aren't thinking outside of their little community. So if you're tempted to think, well, I feel like I'm kind of a salesman or I'm some kind of a traveling charlatan going in and sweeping up money, like that's not what it's about. As you're talking, Heather, I was thinking about Donald Miller's story branding in marketing speak. He would call this a transitional ask. All kinds of companies do this, right? You go to a website and it's like, here's my service, but if you're not interested in buying quite yet, like sign up, give me your email address and I'll send you this free PDF or whatever it is. This is kind of the same thing. And if you're tempted to feel like, well, I don't want to feel like a marketer, I just want to be a missionary. But at the end of the day, your end goal is to mobilize these people and to get them into the Great Commission. Why not use those kind of psychological or just kind of human nature tendencies to do that?
You don't have to exploit them in order to leverage them.
Yeah, it's not exploitation. It's gospel exploitation, which is kind of an oxymoron.
I would call it exploration.
Better.
Because you're exploring a partnership and they're exploring wanting to know what's going on in the world that they're not going to hear when they turn the news on. What's the good stuff that God is doing, So they're exploring too.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. I know this might kind of be going back a little bit in our conversation, but something that came to mind, if you don't have connections, just some ways to become more aware of other churches and what their heartbeat is. So in our community, there's actually like a coalition of pastors from all different denominations meet regularly and have like a really rich prayer together and just kind of pulse on what is happening in our city. And
Mm.
so, because our pastor is part of that, our pastor could be a really meaningful connection to other churches that would be part of that as well. So people could explore whether their city or their community has a coalition kind of like that, or there are a lot of networks of churches these days, and those networks often have a shared interest in specific things, right? Like some networks are built around church planting, some networks are built around denomination, whatever it might be, but that
Mhm.
could also be a really healthy stream to wade into to see who within that network could be a potential church to approach.
That's a great point. So, for example, you could walk into another Acts 29 church and say, "Hey, I attend this Acts 29 church in this city, and I talked to my pastor, and he said I might want to talk to you guys."
Mm-hmm.
That's a good foot in the door too.
So I feel like we've had some really good conversation around finding advocates, finding churches, approaching churches. I think another really important piece of this is determining whether there's alignment between what that church is about and what you are doing, because you're
Mm.
not just looking for money wherever it is to be found. You really are looking for partnership and alignment. And so let's talk about that.
Okay. So you can save yourself a lot of time and grief if you start here. I did put it towards the end of the curriculum because it's a follow up, but when you're actually taking the action to go out and connect with churches, I would start here. And this is getting to know the church, questions to ask yourself, questions to maybe do some research on their website before you even talk to anybody. You want to know if they're going to be a like minded partner with you. What are the priorities of the church? Just some questions to think about. Do they align with your theological views and the theological views of your organization? Would you be comfortable receiving support from them? Would they be comfortable receiving your updates about your mission, the way that you go about doing your mission, the conversions that are happening, the outreach, etc.? Different organizations have their different styles of doing those things, doing ministry. Some
Mhm.
churches may not be a good fit to partner. So that's just a place to start.
So you've learned the hard way.
Me?
Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Do we have any examples of this not working well? Like, is there a cautionary tale amongst us where we could say, I didn't actually prepare, or I didn't really know what I was getting myself into?
Yeah, I want to speak with a lot of generosity of heart, but also give some specifics. But I think I'm just aware that sometimes there can be a disconnect between some expectations that a church has. For example, I know that, some churches feel very strongly about particular translations. And so it's important to them that those that they support use those translations in the work
Mhm.
that they do. But, we've all worked with cross-cultural students, with people that don't speak English as their first language. And so, I mean, honestly, we speak English as our first language, and the King James Bible is kind of hard for the modern English speaker, right? So that would be an example of a situation that would be difficult to navigate because it's just not aligned with what you know to be helpful in your context. Or another consideration, which I think can feel difficult to navigate, is that sometimes what it looks like for a church or even an individual to partner with you has a strong emphasis on the return on investment or kind of numbers, like how many people were baptized, how many people made a decision.
Mhm.
And I think there's so much nuance to that and what's behind that. And that can also be very difficult to navigate when you're actually in more of a relational ministry where it's just a lot of removing rocks, a lot of faithfully showing up every day, which honestly we all know is a lot of what it looks like to share the hope that we have, is just a
Yeah.
preparing and a doing the right thing and not necessarily seeing the results. So those are a couple of things I could think of.
And in this context, removing rocks is the sowing and reaping metaphor. So sometimes you don't even have the ability to plant or water or reap. You're just literally clearing the field.
Right.
I think that's great. And it's not a one size fits all approach. And that's okay that your particular ministry calling and niche doesn't fit generally. A lot of times we are called to specific things, and churches have different focuses, and that's great. It's all a gospel movement. It's all a solution to the Great Commission, and that's okay.
Right. True. I also wanted to bring up some other types of expectations that would be more of administrative things that you would need to consider as a missionary. Like, do I have the time to actually do this, to partner with this church? And so, an example of that would be an application process for support. Some churches have a pretty long process, pretty lengthy pages you have to fill out and multiple meetings with committees that you have to go through. Some churches require extra training and classwork. So, for example, having a certificate from the Perspectives on the World Christian Movement course or something like that. That's a 15-week course, so you may not have the time to do that. Some classes or some churches will expect you to maybe attend their missions conference annually or to host a mission team from their church in your context. If you're overseas, they will want to send a group and have a project to do. In their mind, that's what partnership looks like, which could be a really good thing if you have capacity to host them. So you really want to, as you're going through the process of the initial conversations with the church or with an advocate, you want to have these questions in mind of what will the church expect?
I also had a teammate who had an annual commitment to her congregation, to her church, to file a certain amount of paperwork, a report. And it was quite lengthy. And she was happy to do it because they were very generous. But that's also not out of the question.
Right. So you got to figure out those things that you may not know up front. You could even talk to some other missionaries who are supported by that church and ask them, hey, what's your experience in partnering with this church? What are some of the expectations that they have of you?
Great idea.
So if we wanted to put some skin on this, make it really practical and actionable, what would you guys say are some habits or like a mindset that people could take on or implement as they move forward to put this into practice? And I asked the question, but I have an immediate thought that I'm just going to submit. And I would just say, best practice is always preceded by prayer and seeking the Spirit. And so even though you're being equipped to hopefully reach out to churches you do know, churches you don't know, find advocates, really, we can rely on the Spirit to draw us to the people He wants to. And so don't neglect to seek the Lord in prayer about what you should do, which is maybe so obvious that it doesn't need to be stated, but we also know that it can be one of the first things to go.
I don't think so, Heather. I think we can't ever de-emphasize or overemphasize prayer enough. And I think especially when we get into these types of objectives and things that we're trying to accomplish, it can be very natural just to try to get it done, especially if you're a high achiever and you're very responsible normally. Like we've talked about with Miss Patty, that is just the reality for some of us. And I think in your prayer, also surrendering the outcome, like asking for blessing, asking for success, but also saying, Lord, if it's not meant to be, I give that to you. I'll keep doing it until you lead me to the right people.
Right. And, like in season 3, when we spoke with Callie Davis, having a mindset that can celebrate the no, because you understand that in that no, God is doing something else for them and for you.
I love that. And just recently, we were talking to Bernie as well on the podcast in season 4, right? And he was saying that no can also be a gospel answer. Now, that's great. You have to be able to release that and realize that it is not failure, not your personal failure if somebody says no to you. And that's different than a lot of lines of work that you go into and a lot of objectives and a lot of jobs.
Yeah. I can second that what you said, Andy, about the responsibility, get it done, task oriented mindset, because that's me. Like my strengths finder is like discipline, responsibility. So I'm executive.
Soldier.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. And I can just think of some examples of going into churches and trying to make connections with leaders, and it just didn't pan out for me. And I just beat myself up over it, and I wish I would have had a fundraising coach to talk me through this curriculum just to realize, God is in all of this and he's teaching us so much through the meetings that don't happen and through the things that fall through. But the prayer thing is so important, just bathing it all in prayer, surrendering it to God and just saying, God, you connect me with the people that you want me to be connected with. And, if it works out, I trust you. If it doesn't work out, I trust you.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing just to keep in mind is from a mindset perspective, as Christians, we're encouraged to sow broadly. So why would we think that doesn't apply to our fundraising? Like, how do we know who the Lord is already calling and working on behind the scenes and in their hearts? And if we don't give them a chance to say yes, well, we've missed the opportunity. So I think you have to just cast the net wide.
Yes.
And sometimes you worked and worked and worked. And then Jesus says, well, why don't you cast the net on the other side? So maybe he's asking you to do that too, especially if you're listening to this episode or in this module and you've been on the field for a while. Maybe the Lord's asking you to try something different.
Yeah, that's so good. I think that leads us to humble confidence too, because it's humble because we don't know where the support is going to come from in the end. And so we have to have open hands and trust God for it. But it's also confident in the fact that God asks us to sow broadly, to cast our net generously, to give people an opportunity to take part in the Great Commission. So we can be confident that this is our work is of God. And so it's that humble confidence.
Just drilling it into your head. This is not about me.
Yes, so important.
Andy said, it's not about me. And I think what that makes me think is, man, there's this real sense in which, as Bernie said, you are the asset. You have to protect your like mind and heart. Like self-care is actually a really important thing, but holding self-care wrongly can just totally destroy what you're trying to do. And what I was thinking was like, as a mom, self-care is really important. But if the emphasis becomes me and my self-care, then it actually all falls apart. And so when you say that, Andy, it's not about you, it's like, yeah, 100% it's not about you. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be really aware of caring for yourself and aware of your needs and very proactive with your needs. But if that's what consumes you, if that's what the emphasis becomes, then it actually will all fall apart.
That's good. I mean, anything can be taken to the extreme. And so moderation, it seems like the middle road, it seems to be a healthy way.
Well, and it's just so interesting that so many of the important things in the Christian life, it's like you actually have to put a lot of intention and hard work into that thing. But if that thing becomes the main thing, then it's not good. That applies to parenting, that applies to your ministry, that applies to, like I said, self-care. I mean, we're meant to approach things with a lot of intention and strategy, and we're meant to work hard towards things without making those things the ultimate thing.
We can idolize anything.
Yeah.
Even really good things.
True. We can idolize having a specific church on our support list. Or, if I can just get this name and then I can drop this name and tell other people, then other people will get on board. No, that's not where we're putting our hope and confidence in.
Right. Right. Okay. So as we kind of wrap up this episode of the series, what encouragement would you guys want to leave our listeners with?
Humble confidence is what was my key takeaway.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would agree. Humble confidence seems like a good phrase to keep in mind.
Yeah.
All right. Well, as we close out this conversation of the module, we hope that you, as the listener, have found it beneficial. Thanks for joining me today, guys. And we'll be back again to talk about another element of partnering with churches.
Looking forward to it.
Appreciate it.
It's Not About the Money is presented by Provisio Fundraising Solutions. Provisio equips support-based workers with flexible training, practical resources, and one-on-one coaching. Find out more at provisiofundraising.com.